سلام عليكم. Excuse me, I had a problem. I couldn't open the Darso website, but now it's correct and we can start our class. Hello again to you all. Welcome to our today's session. In our today's class, we're going to continue the XP process. The XP process, in the previous session, we have started the XP methodology and the process, and we talked about the 6 phases of the XP process. The first phase is the exploration. The second one is the planning. The third one is the iterations to the first release. The fourth one is the productionizing. The fifth one is the maintenance, and the last one is the death phase. So the first one is the exploration. We talked about the exploration, and the phases number 2, 3, and 4 are called the development engine. Phase number 2, 3, and 4 are called the development engine of the XP process. They are also called the maintenance phases because the maintenance phase includes the iterative performance of these 3 phases too. So in the previous session, we talked about the development engine, the top level activities of the development engine, which are the release planning, the plan for the release, this release, the current release. So we have planning for each release. Then we have iterations that includes developing, designing, testing for this release. So we have multiple iterations to develop the current release, and after that we have some acceptance tests that must be performed on each release. And I think we were here, the release planning. Yes, we talked until this slide. It's right. Is it right? We were here. Okay, the planning phase, the release planning activity includes 3 main activities. First is the estimation of the development time. The developers should estimate the time that is required to implement each one of the user stories, and they should write down the estimation on the index card of that user story. In the XP process, we have index cards for each user story. On each index card, we write the name of each user story, and in the planning phase, we should write down the estimation time too. The next one is that to break down the stories that require more than 3 weeks, because we said that in XP process each iteration should be no longer than 3 weeks. So if we have a user story that requires more than 3 weeks to be implemented, we should break that story down into smaller ones. And also, if we have user stories that take less than 1 week, then we need to merge some of those small stories and create a bigger one. So in the XP process, we have a limitation of between 1 week to 3 weeks for each user story. And if we don't have enough information for our estimation, and the estimates are not reliable enough, then we use Spark solutions. We develop Spark solutions in order to improve the estimations that we made. After estimating the development time, the next activity is to prioritize the user stories. The customer should prioritize the user stories. The customer can use different factors, for example, the development time and also the business value and the importance of each user story to prioritize them. And after that, we can plan the release, the first release. So based on the list of the user stories that we have and the estimation and the prioritization that we have done on that user stories, the team can select a minimal of the most valuable and most important set of user stories for implementation in the first release. So we want to make sure that the core requirements, the most valuable user stories, are going to be implemented in the first version. And also the team should agree on the release date. The team members also should decide on the iteration duration of the process. We have the limitation of 1 to 3 weeks. So between 1 week to 3 weeks, the team can decide on one duration. For example, 2 weeks. For example, 2.5 weeks. After that, all the iterations should be the same. And they should be the same, and they should have the same duration. The next activity in the XP process, the next phase is the iteration to first release. The iteration to first release. Where is the iteration to first release? We have here the iteration to first release, phase number 3. Phase number 1 was exploration, phase number 2 was planning, and phase number 3 is the iteration to the first release. In the iteration to first release, we have two high-level activities. First, the iteration planning. So we have here again the planning activity. This planning is just for the current iteration. The previous planning was for the whole release. Here we have the release planning. The release planning for the whole release. But in the iteration, we have the first activity, we have the iteration planning. So Here, the iteration planning is the planning activity for just the current iteration. And then the development activity. In the iteration planning activity, in the start of each iteration, we should have a planning meeting. In the planning meeting, a subset of user stories are selected to be implemented in that iteration. And also, if we have any failed acceptance tests from the previous iteration, we should also include those acceptance tests to rectify in this iteration. Based on the selected user stories and the failed acceptance test, a set of programming tasks are identified and then assigned to to each one of the development team members. After planning, team members should develop those selected user stories. The development activity is also an iterative process itself. So in each iteration, the development also includes some iterations. These are daily cycles. So in each iteration, we have development. Development includes some daily cycles. Daily cycles, every day we have one cycle in each daily cycle. First of all, in the first thing in the morning, we have a daily stand-up meeting. And after that, different team members should do tasks like analysis, design, code, testing, integration to the collective code, ownership, and etc. So every day, just like the agile daily scrum, every day, first of all, the first thing in the morning, we have a daily stand-up meeting, and then the team members do different tasks of software engineering, for example, analysis, design, integration, testing, and etc. So in the iteration activity, we have the iteration planning and the development. The iteration planning have inputs from the previous iteration. It's not the next iteration, it's previous iteration. From the previous iteration, we have the project velocity, the velocity of the project, the velocity of the developers team in the previous iteration. We also have the release plan, user stories in the release plan. In the iteration plan, we select a subset of user stories from the release plan. And also, if we have some bugs in the previous iteration that failed the acceptance test, we should consider those failed acceptance tests too. After planning, we have an iteration plan, and we can develop based on that iteration plan. In the development process, we can add new functionalities to the previous version, or we can fix some of the bugs from the previous version. The team members can also learn from the previous iteration and use the project velocity in the previous iteration for the planning of the current iteration. Yes, Mr. Ali Yasseri. Users that can help us in the acceptance test can be introduced by the customer, or we can select a set of users that can represent our final users. So it's very important to select good representative for our users. They are a group of users, not all the users. Mr. Az-Zubaydi. Mr. Az-Zubaydi, we didn't talk about scope or resources or time or quality. Mr. Az-Zubaydi, we didn't talk about these variables in a project. We are just talking about the XView process. Okay. Or maybe I couldn't understand your question well. So yes, it's out of session. It's out of this course, but we can discuss your question if we have enough time. So we have different factors for quantifying a project. Okay, for different projects, we can use different factors for quantifying that project. Thank you, Mr. Az-Zubaydi. If we had enough time at the end of the session, then we can discuss over your question. Okay, so the activities in each iteration. In each iteration, we have two main activities, iteration planning and then development. Now we want to talk more about development. We want to go into the details of the development. What do we do in the development activity? Okay, before that, the planning. In the iteration planning, we have three activities. First of them is to select user stories to be implemented in the next iteration, and also the failed acceptance test that must be rectified. We use the release plan to select our user stories. You also saw in this picture that user stories are selected from the release plan. So we have a plan for the release, and for each iteration we should select our user stories from that plan, the release plan. We cannot select from the initial set of user stories because we have a release plan. So we should select the user stories based on the release plan. And also we should consider the failed acceptance test from the previous iteration. And we can use our experience in the previous iterations to calculate the project velocity. The project velocity will help us to estimate the required time for completing each one of the user stories. So in each iteration, we used our experience in the previous iteration to calculate the project velocity, to update the project velocity. After identifying the user stories to be implemented in this iteration and the failed acceptance test from the previous iteration, we should identify the programming tasks of the current iteration. The developers should break down the user stories and the debugging jobs into programming tasks. Sure, so we have a set of tasks based on the selected user stories. These tasks are also written down on the user story index cards. After that, the identified tasks should be assigned to team members, to the programmers, and each one of those team members should estimate the time that they require to complete their tasks. And they should make sure that the time, they have enough time for completing those tasks. Also, we have a limitation in our tasks. The constraint that we have is that for each task we have about 1 to 3 days. So the developers should define tasks that can take long as between 1 to 3 days. The next activity was development. We talked about iteration planning. Now we're going to talk about the development activity in the XP process. The development includes two activities. The first thing in each day, we should hold a daily stand-up meeting. That is a short meeting every morning in order to communicate problems and also solutions and to keep the team on track. After that, each one of the developers, each one of the team members should work on their assigned tasks and do different tasks such as analysis, design, coding, testing, and integrating the tested code into a collective code ownership environment. The collective code ownership means that all the code that are developed by different programmers are going to be put into a shared code repository. So all the developers have access to this repository, and all of them can change any part of the code that they want. So they can change any part of the codes in the repository. For example, they can add functionality, they can fix some bugs, or they can refactor the codes. So the repository, the collective code ownership, is open to all of the developers in the team. Another issue to remind is that in XP project development, this is to make the collective code ownership possible and working. So the developers have to create unit tests for their code, and all the code in the code repository includes unit tests. They form a suite of tests, a test suite, And this suite should be automatically applied on the codes, because we need to do all these tests again and again and again, and it's really time consuming, so we need to automate the testing. So we use different tools and frameworks for automating the tests. These tests will safeguard the repository from malignant changes or from other side effects. So if we want to add a code into a repository, or if we change a code in the repository, we should apply all these test suites on that code again, and it must pass all the test suites. We have also acceptance tests and black box acceptance tests. These acceptance tests are derived from the user stories. The test scenarios are derived from the user stories that are defined by the customer. And we should frequently apply these acceptance tests to the code. So again, these acceptance tests should also be automated by different testing tools and frameworks. So let's have a more detailed look at the development activity. Includes two activities: stand-up meeting and collective code ownership. The stand-up meeting is based on the iteration plan and the failed acceptance test from the previous day. And if we have any unfinished tasks, they should be also included in today's tasks. After developing all these new tasks or all these unfinished tasks, then we should add them to the collective code ownership. They can be a new functionality, or they can be fixes for previous bugs. The activities that we do in the collective code ownership includes these activities. First, the programmers work in pairs. So we have two programmers on one machine. This is called the pair programming. Two programmers work together on one machine. These programmers use CRC cards, the collaboration and responsibility cards, in order to create the simplest design that is possible. And anytime that the code is complicated, or if there is any inconsistency in the code, it's very important to do the refactoring. The refactoring can remove those complexity and eliminate redundancies, so the readability of the code is increased. It's very important because different developers work on various parts of the code, so it's very important to keep the code as simple as possible and as readable as possible. And also, all the programmers should obey a common coding standard. This will help the developers to easily understand the code of other developers, and it's very helpful in helping developers to move from pairs and work on different parts of the code. Developers are moved around. They can join different pairs or left different pairs, so they can acquire knowledge about different parts of the system. Knowing about different parts of the system will help the developers to reduce the cost of changes, to the team structure, and also will help to relieve overloading and coding bottlenecks. In the XP process, we have frequent builds. So, for example, we can have different builds in one day or hourly days. And also in XP, we encourage continuous integration. Work at a sustainable pace for about 40 hours a week as a norm. And the developers should not be allowed to work overtime for 2 weeks in a row because of the tiredness and the problems that can make to the pair programming style. Okay, Mr. Aliosari. How many teams in XP process? In XP process, we have one team. But if you mean how many pairs, we can have different pairs. We can have different pairs. Okay, Mr. Aliosari? So we have one team, but if you mean pairs, we have different pairs. For example, if we have 10 developers, then we can have 5 pairs. Okay, thank you. So this is the activities, this is a picture of the activities in the collective code ownership environment. The developers should first use CRC cards to make the complex problems in a simple way, to have the simplest design possible for our problem. The tasks that should be the unfinished tasks, or the tasks that should be implemented in every day, plus the acceptance tests that are failed from the previous day are defined. Then the developers are going to be paired up and create a pair to work on the same machine. They first should develop the unit test for the code that they are writing. And then using the pair programming approach, they should develop the code to pass that unit test, and if the unit test fails, then they should again repeat the pair programming to make the code to pass the unit test. In developing that part of the code, if another expertise is needed, if any help is needed, then people can move around, can change their pair, and new developers can join the pair. If the code gets complex or inconsistent, then the refactoring is used to make the code simple. After unit tests are passed, then the new functionality can be integrated into the previous code, and all the unit tests must be passed. That if you want to add new functionality, all the unit tests must be passed. After that, we should also run the acceptance test, and all the acceptance tests also should be passed. Mr. Zovaid, no, CRC is not a code. CRC is a card. Collaboration. Let me write down. Collaboration, responsibility, card. They are some card for each class. We have a card for each task. We can have a card for each user story. We can have a card. In each card, we can define the collaboration that is required to make that responsibility work. Okay, so for each, thank you, Mr. Zoe. For example, in the object-oriented era, we have a card for each class, the responsibility of that class, and if that class requires collaboration to other classes to do that responsibility, we write down all those responsibilities and collaborations on a card. Okay, Mr. Zoe, thank you for your question. Okay, if you have any question until now, if you have any other question until now, please ask your question. Then we can continue our slide. Mr. Al-Emor, we don't have pair of programs, we have pair of programmers. We have pair of programmers. It means that we have two. Yes, Mr. Al-Emor. Pair programmers. Pair programming means two people work together. Two people, two programmers work together. Okay, so we have two programmers work with each other on one machine. Okay, right, Mr. Al-Amar? We don't have two programs. We have two programmers. We have two people working together. Okay, Mr. Al-Amar. Thank you, Mr. Al-Amar. Okay, any other question? Until now, if you have any other question, please ask your questions. Okay, so you don't have any question? If you have any question, please ask your question. Okay, the next phase is the productionizing. The productionizing is mainly a verification and validation phase, a testing phase, a system level testing, which the acceptance are performed. These acceptance tests are mostly developed during the iterations to first release phase. So in the first iteration to the first release phase. And then we use these acceptance tests again and again as regression test. Regression test means we run these tests again and again after any change, after any uh, um, uh, after adding new functionalities, we run these acceptance tests again. If any defects, if any bugs are found, then they should be resolved during the iterations of the main development cycle. So if we have any failed acceptance test and we found any bugs here in the development engine, if we have any failed acceptance tests, we found any defect or bugs, they should be resolved in the next execution of the development engine. After the testing, we get the user's approval of the system and we make sure that the system is ready for deployment, then we should deploy the new release into the production environment. So this the first release, the core version of the system, is introduced and is executed into the user environment. The deployment involves the usual integration, conversion, tuning, training, and documentation activity. The typical activities in the deployment effort. If we required any tuning or stabilization action on the release, then that tuning and stabilization action is regarded as a development activity. We perform the development activities in short iterations. So if we require any tuning or stabilization activity, then we should perform them in short iterations. Usually the next phase is the maintenance phase. The maintenance phase is when the first version of the system, the first release of the system, is deployed at the user's environment, and we have a core set of user stories that are implemented in the first version and now can be used by the user. And we have other remaining user stories that are that should be also implemented. In the maintenance phase, these remaining user stories are going to be implemented and integrated into the system that is running now, and integrated into the first version of the system. The maintenance includes the same activities in the development engine phases, the 3 phases that we have in the development engine. Phase number 2, planning. Phase number 3, iterations to release. And phase number 4, productionizing. So the maintenance phase includes the 3 main phases of the XP process. The maintenance is also dependent on the evolving set of user requirements, user stories. So if we have any change in the user stories, or if we have new user stories in the system, then it's acceptable in the maintenance phase. During maintenance phase, we will develop small releases of the system by adding new functionality and also by fixing some acceptance tests that are failed. And these small releases should be integrated into the first release of the system, which is running at the user's environment. So it's very important to note that the new releases in the maintenance phase should be integrated into a running version of the system, into a running system.
In the maintenance phase, we may have some new requirements. These new requirements that are added to the user stories that we have from before are just the same as the user stories in the list. So there's not any difference between the requirements or the user stories from the list, the remaining user stories from the list, and the user stories, the new user stories that arise in the maintenance phase. The development team should treat them similarly. The maintenance phase will continue until the software is not maintainable, which means that we have no more user stories to develop, or it's not possible to evolve the system. It's not possible to change the system, to develop new functionalities, or to fix the bugs that are in the system. So if it is unnecessary or impossible to maintain the system, then the system is called, the project is declared dead, and we enter the last phase, the sixth phase, which is the death phase. The main activities that should be performed in the death phase are: first, declaring the project as closed. So the team should wrap up the remaining legal or financial or social loose ends of the project, first of all. And second, sometimes teams or development organizations do some post-mortem documentation and reviews. They prepare a short document and provide a brief summary of the system that is developed in that project, and they can write down a review report, including the lessons learned from that project. These are useful as the experience of the development team for the next project. So just like other methodologies in our course, the XP methodology has also some strengths and weaknesses. But before going to the strengths and weaknesses of the XP process, if you have any question until now, please ask your questions. Yes, Mr. Zovaid, the maintenance phase is the last stage for developing the user stories or changing the user stories. But the maintenance in XP process is an iterative phase. So maintenance is going to be repeated again and again and again. Okay? So we don't have just one maintenance phase. We have iterative maintenance activities. Okay, Mr. Zovair? Okay, thank you very much for your question. Okay, if you have any other question, please ask before going to how many, Mr. Azobaidi, how many stories can be implemented before a given time? It depends to the user stories that you have, and it depends on the deadline that you have. I don't have a specific number. Let me search. Okay, Mr. Azobaidi, I just searched, and there is a range of 5 to 15, or maybe 4 to 15 user stories in each iteration. But you can consider that maybe 5 to 15 user stories can be a good estimation of the user stories that we can have in each iteration. How long each user story? For each user story, we have limitations here. In the XP process, we have a limitation of 1 week to 3 weeks for each user story. So if we have smaller user stories that take less than 1 week, and if we have big user stories that need more than 3 weeks, also we need to break them down into smaller ones. No, Mr. Azobaidi, 5 to 15. 5 to 15. Okay, Mr. Azobaidi, 5 to 15 user stories in each iteration. Okay, thank you, Mr. Azobaidi, for your question. Very good question. Thank you very much. Okay, other students, do you have any question? Thank you very much, Mr. Azobaidi. If you have any other question, let's talk about the strengths and the weaknesses. First, the strengths of the XP process is that it is an iterative and incremental process. And we have incremental development of the software. Is that the XP process is based on the system functionalities that are presented in the form of user stories. So in each will add to the functionality of the system. The XP is tuned iteration based on the feedback of the previous iteration. For example, we have the velocity of the project from the previous iteration in our planning for the next iteration. In the XP process, we also have a good traceability. We have they use to drive the acceptance test, the test scenarios of the acceptance tests, And the tasks for developing each user story are also defined based on that user story, the code that is passed that acceptance test. So we have a clear traceability in the XP process. In XP, we develop the system based on a system architecture or a metaphor. This architecture, this spike and this architectural spike is identified through prototyping. In XP, we have active user involvement. The acceptance tests are written and also run by the users or representative of the users. The XP process provides us with a test-based development. The acceptance tests are derived from the user stories, and then the system is developed and the codes are developed that can pass those acceptance tests. So we have first the tests and then the development. The XP, therefore the XP is a test-based development approach. The next one is that we have defined standards that are enforced on our coding, because in the XP process we have people that moving around the pairs, and also we have a collective code ownership that allows all the developers to change every part of the code that they want. So it's very important to have a standard on coding. In XP, we have an early release of the first version of the system, and after that we have frequent releases in the maintenance phase. The requirements of the system, the user's stories are allowed to evolve over time in the maintenance phase. Also, they can be changed and new user stories can be added into the list of our requirements. We have an iterative development engine, and we have a proper planning and also reviewing before and after this development engine. The planning and reviewing can help to control the development engine to get the required result. In the XP process, we have an explicit coverage of maintenance phase. The maintenance phase in the XP process also is the bulk of the development effort, because we have the first release in the first iteration, and after that other iterations in the maintenance phase develop the remaining user stories of the software. After each iteration and after each release, we have the validation, the acceptance test. So we have continuous validation in the XP process, and also the new codes that provide new functionalities are continually integrated into the code base. So we have continuous integration. Anytime that the code gets complex or if there is any inconsistency in the code, the developers can do refactoring. The refactoring help us to make the codes simple and consistent. It's very useful for the developers to easily understand the code and different parts of the code, and to maintain the code. So refactoring is one of the most important tasks in the XP process. Okay, Mr. Al-Hajami, why maintenance is the the bulk of development effort, not testing. Maintenance is important because in maintenance we have all these 3 phases. Let me show you this picture. In this picture we have here the maintenance. The maintenance phase includes planning, developing, and testing. So maintenance includes planning, iteration to release, which is developing, and productionizing, which is testing. So maintenance includes planning, developing, and testing. So the maintenance is a bulk of the development effort. After the first release, we have all the remaining user stories, the remaining requirements to be implemented in the maintenance phase. So maintenance phase is the most affordable phase. Okay, Mr. Al-Hajami, or okay, thank you very much. Okay, any other question? Okay, so let's talk about the weaknesses. What are the weaknesses of the XView process? Maybe the most important one is that the XView process is rather vague. The process is typically considered as an example and a set of principles and practices, and not a complete methodology. Just like the Scrum methodology, we have limited evidence of scalability in the XView process too. So if we have a complicated project or if we have a big size project, we cannot use the XView process. This is a seamless, this is not a seamless process methodology, because we have hiccups, we have jumps from user stories to coding and to testing and to so we don't have seamlessness in the XView process. The XView process requires automated tools and frameworks for testing and for making the collective code ownership to be practicable. In the XView process, although we have the architectural spike and we have the system metaphor, but we don't have any clear-cut design effort. We don't have an independent activity for designing. In XP also, we try not to model, and so we do modeling if we have to. And maybe the most modeling tools that we use are the CRC codes, and other modeling are dependent to the developers if they decide themselves to use modeling or not. And also in the XView process, we have a lack of formalism. So maybe for new projects with new technologies, or for complicated projects, we cannot use the XView process. These are references of the course, and this slide on the XView process is finished. Mr. Az-Zubaydi, about code quality, we have code quality. I think we have code quality because we have some standards on coding. We have standards on coding. So I think we have code quality, but maybe we don't have some quality factors for the final software. For example, some quality attributes like reliability, maybe reliability, some quality factors like yes, Mr. Azobaidi, it may cause defects, but we have some acceptance tests that must be passed, so the defects can be found. But for example, reliability in critical safety systems, or safety critical systems, we don't have these qualities, so maybe we say that XP is not good for some critical systems with high quality demands. Yes, Mr. Zubaidi? Any other question? Thank you, Mr. Al-Zubaidi. Thank you for your good questions. If there is any other questions from our today's slides, please ask. Yes, Mr. Al-Yasiri, no, we don't have the final version. We have the latest version. And in each new release, in each small release, we have some bugs that are fixed, or we have some small new functionalities that are integrated into the previous version. This process is incremental, so no, until the test phase, we don't have the final version. We have the latest version and the new version. Okay? Yes, Mr. Al-Hajami, the best agile methodology, you mean? It's different. It depends on the project that you are going to work on. It depends on the users that you have. Depends on the team members, the development team that you have. Okay, so it's different, but some of these agile methodologies are more popular and more practiced. For example, I think Scrum is more popular. It doesn't mean that Scrum is always good. Sometimes XP is better than Scrum, but the most popular one is the Scrum methodology. Okay? Thank you, Mr. Al-Hajami, for your good question. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you everyone for thank you, Mr. Kashosh. Thank you everyone for being present in our class and for participating in our today's session. If you don't have any question, we can finish our today's session. Thank you, Mr. Azobaidi. You're welcome. Thank you everyone. Thank you very much for your participation in our today's class. Another thing that I want to talk about you in the next session, please remind me to talk about the midterm exam. Okay, in the next session, we should talk about the midterm exam. Okay, thank you very much. Have a good day and goodbye. خدا حافظ. خدا نگهدار.